Bexley Harlow, 32, discovered her parents had secretly given her younger brother $230,000 for his startup, while telling her she was too irresponsible to help with her education loans. That Sunday dinner revelation shattered everything she believed about her family. What followed would transform not just her life but dismantle a generational pattern of favoritism nobody saw coming. Before we dive into this wild family drama, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below and hit that subscribe button if family revenge stories are your guilty pleasure. Trust me, what happened after I confronted my parents about their blatant favoritism will have your jaw on the floor. Let's get into how everything unfolded. Growing up in suburban Connecticut, Bexley had always felt the subtle inequities in her parents' treatment of her versus her younger brother Elliot. Their parents, Margaret and Richard Harlow, were both successful professionals, her mother a hospital administrator and her father an engineering consultant. The Harlows lived comfortably in a colonial-style home with a perfectly manicured lawn that matched their carefully curated image as the ideal American family. From childhood, Elliot had been positioned as the golden child, his academic achievements celebrated with lavish gifts, while Bexley's equally impressive accomplishments were met with muted recognition. When Bexley earned a scholarship to Columbia for her undergraduate studies in journalism, her parents merely nodded with approval. When Elliot got into Princeton for business economics with a partial scholarship, their parents threw an elaborate party inviting extended family and friends to celebrate. "You're lucky to have that scholarship," her mother had commented during Bexley's college send-off. "We need to save our resources for your brother's future. He'll be supporting a family someday." Those subtle dismissals accumulated over time, creating fracture lines in Bexley's self-confidence. Despite graduating with honors and landing a position at a prestigious digital media company in Manhattan, she still carried the invisible weight of never quite measuring up in her parents' eyes. After college, Bexley worked tirelessly to establish herself, taking on multiple freelance projects while managing her full-time job to pay off her remaining student loans. She lived in a tiny Brooklyn apartment with 2 roommates, carefully budgeting every expense. Meanwhile, Elliot moved back home after graduation to focus on his entrepreneurial ventures while their parents covered his living expenses. During family gatherings, the conversation inevitably gravitated toward Elliot's latest business ideas. "Your brother is building something important," her father would announce proudly at holiday dinners. "He's thinking about generational wealth, not just a paycheck." The implication that Bexley's career choice was somehow inferior stung, but she had grown accustomed to swallowing her frustrations. She had built a life for herself, independent of her parents' approval. Finding purpose in her work as an investigative journalist, focusing on economic inequality, an ironic specialization given her family dynamics. By her early 30s, Bexley had finally achieved a measure of professional recognition, winning a regional award for her series on housing discrimination. She had also managed to pay off her student loans entirely through disciplined saving and strategic career moves. The achievement felt monumental. She had done it completely on her own without the safety net her brother had always enjoyed. "You know," her colleague Jessica remarked after Bexley's awards ceremony, which her parents had declined to attend, "most parents would be shouting from the rooftops if their kid accomplished what you have." Bexley had simply shrugged. "My family's different," she replied, the practiced response, hiding years of hurt. "They show their support in other ways." But the truth was, she couldn't remember the last time her parents had shown genuine pride in her achievements. Their relationship had settled into a pattern of obligatory monthly phone calls and occasional holiday visits, during which Bexley performed the role of the dutiful daughter while carefully guarding her emotional vulnerabilities. That Sunday in April, when Bexley drove to her parents' house for their monthly family dinner, she had no inkling that the carefully maintained facade of family harmony was about to shatter completely. She arrived bearing a bottle of her mother's favorite Chardonnay and a forced smile, mentally preparing herself for another evening of Elliot-centered conversation. Little did she know that this dinner would expose the true extent of her parents' favoritism, a revelation that would force her to redefine not just her relationship with her family, but her understanding of her own worth. The revelation came during what should have been a routine Sunday dinner. Bexley had arrived at her parents' home with news of her own. She had been saving diligently and was considering purchasing her first apartment. It was a modest one-bedroom in Astoria, but it represented years of financial discipline and career advancement. She waited for a natural pause in the conversation to share her news, hoping for at least a perfunctory acknowledgement. "So I've been pre-approved for a mortgage," she mentioned as her mother served the apple pie. "I found a place in Queens that I really love." Her father nodded absently. "That's nice, honey. But have you considered waiting? Real estate in New York is overpriced, and you'd be tying up your savings." Before Bexley could respond, her mother chimed in. "Speaking of exciting news, Elliot's startup secured its first major investor yesterday." The familiar pivot away from her achievements to Elliot's latest venture was nothing new, but what followed would change everything. "The investor was impressed with what we've built so far," Elliot said, barely containing his excitement. "Dad, Mom, I couldn't have done it without your seed money. Having that $230,000 to develop the prototype made all the difference." Bexley's fork clattered against her plate. "I'm sorry, what $230,000?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the dining room. Her mother busied herself with clearing plates while her father cleared his throat. "We helped Elliot with his business venture," he finally said. "It's an investment in his future." "An investment," Bexley repeated, her voice eerily calm despite the storm brewing inside. "Interesting. I seem to recall begging for help with my student loans that I ended up paying off entirely on my own because you said you didn't have extra funds to spare." Her mother's lips thinned. "That was different, Bexley. Education is something you should take responsibility for. Elliot's business will benefit the whole family eventually." "The whole family," Bexley echoed. "You mean the family that watched me work 3 jobs during college while Elliot got a new car for his study motivation?" Elliot shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Bex, it's not like that. Mom and Dad are just supporting my business acumen." "Your business acumen," she repeated. "Right. And my career choice, investigating housing discrimination and economic inequality. That's just what a hobby." Her father's expression hardened. "Now, Bexley, there's no need to get emotional. Elliot has a vision that could lead to significant returns. Your journalism is, well, it's admirable, but it's not exactly going to secure anyone's financial future." The condescension in his tone was the match that finally ignited years of suppressed resentment. "So that's really what this is about. Financial returns on your parental investment." "Don't twist my words," her father snapped. "We're proud of you, but you've always been more impulsive than your brother. Less pragmatic." "Elliot thinks things through." Impulsive, Bexley's voice rose. "I paid off $87 0-inches student loans while supporting myself entirely in one of the most expensive cities in the country. I've never asked you for anything except the same support you've freely given Elliot." Her mother's face flushed with anger. "That's not fair, Bexley. We raised you, clothed you, put a roof over your head. Basic parental obligations aren't special favors," Mom Bexley cut in. "But $230,000, that's a choice. A choice you made for him and explicitly denied me." "You're being dramatic," her father dismissed. "This is exactly why we've been careful with financial assistance for you. You're too emotional, too reactive. Frankly, your attitude right now is proving our point about your lack of maturity." The words hit Bexley like physical blows. All those years of striving for approval, of telling herself that her parents' favoritism was just her imagination. It had all been a lie she told herself to preserve her relationship with her family. I see, she said quietly, standing up from the table. Thank you for finally being honest about where I stand. Where are you going? Her mother demanded. You're acting like a child. No, Bexley replied, gathering her purse and keys. For the first time, I'm acting like someone who recognizes her own worth. Someone who won't keep coming back for scraps of affection from people who have made it abundantly clear where their priorities lie. If you walk out that door, her father warned, you'll regret making this scene. Bexley paused at the threshold, a strange calm settling over her. The only thing I regret is spending 32 years trying to earn love that should have been freely given. The door closed behind her with quiet finality, the spring evening air cool against her flushed face. As she drove away from her childhood home, tears blurred her vision, but beneath the pain was something unexpected, a sense of liberation. For the first time, she was seeing her family dynamics with perfect clarity, and that clarity, however painful, was the first step towards something new. In the weeks following her dramatic exit from her parents' house, Bexley implemented what she privately called Operation Disconnect. She blocked her parents' numbers, removed them from her social media, and informed her workplace receptionist that calls from Margaret or Richard Harlow should not be put through. The silence was both liberating and excruciating. For the first time in her adult life, Bexley wasn't performing the role of the grateful, accommodating daughter. She wasn't swallowing her feelings to maintain family harmony or downplaying her achievements to avoid making her brother uncomfortable. The freedom was intoxicating, but the grief of what she had lost, or perhaps never truly had, washed over her in unexpected moments. 3 days after the confrontation, Elliot called. Mom and Dad are upset, he said, without preamble. They said you made a scene and stormed out. Is that what they told you? Bexley asked, unsurprised by her parents' revisionist history. Did they mention dropping the bombshell about giving you $230,000 while watching me struggle with student debt for years? A pause. Look, that money was a business investment, not a gift. Of course it was. Bexley replied, the bitterness she'd suppressed for years finally finding voice. Just like the down payment on your first car was an investment in your future independence. Just like your semester abroad was an investment in your global business perspective. Funny how their investments always seem to benefit you directly. You're being unfair, Elliot protested. I've worked hard. I'm not saying you haven't, Bexley interrupted. I'm saying they gave you a head start. They explicitly denied me, and then had the audacity to call me a failure for having to run the race from 20 yards behind. The line went quiet for several seconds. They never meant to hurt you, Bex. Intent doesn't erase impact, Elliot, and honestly, I'm not convinced about their intent either. They made calculated decisions consistently for decades that communicated exactly what they thought of me versus you. What do you want from them? An apology, Bexley considered the question. I'm past wanting anything from them. What I'm doing now is setting boundaries, something I should have done years ago. After hanging up, Bexley sat in her tiny apartment surrounded by the life she'd built entirely on her own terms. The walls were adorned with framed articles she'd written, photographs from investigative trips, and a shelf displaying her journalism awards. It wasn't much by her parents' standards, but it was hers, earned through grit and talent rather than parental subsidy. A week into her silence, the messages started. First, from her mother Bexley, this silent treatment is childish. Call us when you're ready to be an adult about this. Then, her father, your mother is upset. Whatever point you're trying to make, it's time to let it go. The lack of acknowledgement, the refusal to recognize how deeply their favoritism had wounded her, only reinforced Bexley's resolve. She drafted countless responses but sent none of them. What was the point? They would twist her words, minimize her feelings, and ultimately make her question her own reality, as they had done her entire life. Instead, she channeled her emotional turmoil into her work. She pitched a series on financial inequality within families, how inheritance practices, educational support, and access to family resources created disparities that could last generations. Her editor approved it enthusiastically, recognizing the personal fire behind the professional pitch. As May turned to June, the messages from her parents grew less frequent. Their tone shifted from commanding to cajoling, with occasional hints of genuine concern. But none contained what Bexley needed most: acknowledgement of the inequality, an apology for the favoritism, or any indication that they understood how their actions had affected her. On her birthday in late June, a package arrived at her apartment. Inside was an expensive leather journal with her initials embossed on the cover and a card signed by her parents. "We miss you. Please come home for dinner soon." The gift felt like a bandage offered for a gaping wound, inadequate and almost insulting in its simplicity. They thought a pretty journal could compensate for years of emotional neglect and financial inequality. Bexley placed the unopened journal on her bookshelf, a tangible reminder of her parents' inability to truly see her. Meanwhile, Bexley was making progress in other areas of her life. The first article in her Family Financial Inequality series was published to significant engagement. She joined a support group for adult children navigating complicated family relationships, finding solace in the shared experiences of others who understood the complex grief of family estrangement. Her therapist, Dr. Chen, helped her process the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. "You're mourning the parents you deserved but never had," Dr. Chen observed during one particularly emotional session. "That's a profound loss." By midsummer, Bexley had established a new routine untethered from the obligation of family dinners and performative phone calls. She expanded her social circle, deepened existing friendships, and even began dating again after a 2-year hiatus. The space created by cutting contact with her parents was gradually filling with connections that felt genuine and reciprocal. When her colleague Jessica asked how she was handling the estrangement, Bexley surprised herself with her answer. "I'm not just surviving it, I'm discovering parts of myself that I never knew existed. Parts that were always trying to contort themselves into shapes my parents would approve of." What Bexley didn't realize was that her silence was having an unexpected impact, not just on her own life, but on the carefully constructed family narrative her parents had maintained for decades. As summer progressed, fissures were beginning to appear in places she couldn't yet see, setting the stage for revelations that would shake the Harlow family to its foundation. By August, 3 months into her estrangement from her parents, Bexley had settled into a new normal. Her Family Financial Inequality series had gained national attention, earning her an interview on a popular morning news program. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her personal pain had become the catalyst for her most significant professional success to date. One sweltering Wednesday afternoon, Bexley was working from a coffee shop near her apartment when her phone lit up with an unexpected name: Aunt Vivian. Her mother's sister had always been somewhat distant, a free-spirited photographer who traveled extensively and appeared at family functions just often enough to maintain connections without getting entangled in the place's day-to-day dynamics. "Bexley, it's Vivian. Do you have time to talk?" Curious about this rare direct contact, Bexley agreed to meet her aunt at a restaurant in the city that evening. She arrived early, rehearsing responses to what she assumed would be a plea to reconcile with her parents. Instead, what Aunt Vivian shared would completely reshape Bexley's understanding of her family history. "I've been watching from the sidelines for too long," Vivian said after they ordered, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her water glass. "When I saw your segment on financial favoritism within families, I realized you were telling my story too, our family's story. Bexley's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Your mother wasn't an only child, as you might have assumed, given how rarely I'm around, Vivian explained. We had a brother, Uncle David. You never met him because he was estranged from the family before you were born. Mom has a brother. Bexley's shock was evident. In all her 32 years, her mother had never once mentioned having a brother. Had Vivian corrected gently. David passed away 5 years ago. Heart attack at 58. Your mother didn't attend the funeral. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Why would she cut off her own brother completely? Vivian took a deep breath. The official story was that David was irresponsible with money made, poor life choices, and cut himself off from the family when our parents refused to bail him out of his financial troubles. The parallel to Bexley's own situation sent a chill down her spine. And the unofficial story, our parents, your grandparents, favored your mother from childhood. They paid for her college education in full, helped with the down payment on her first house with Richard, and left her the bulk of their estate when they died. Vivian's eyes held a familiar pain. David and I received token inheritances, but Margaret got nearly everything. Why? Bexley asked, her journalist instinct kicking in despite her personal connection to the story. On paper, because she was the responsible one who made sensible choices, medical administration instead of David's passion for music or my interest in photography. Vivian's smile was sad. The real reason was more complicated. Margaret always knew exactly how to position herself as the perfect daughter. She reflected back to our parents exactly what they wanted to see. Bexley's mind was racing. So, my mother is essentially repeating the pattern, creating the same dynamic with her own children that her parents created. History doesn't just rhyme in this family, Bexley. It photocopies. Vivian pulled out a worn manila envelope from her bag. I came across these when I was cleaning out my storage unit last month. Letters between David and our parents spanning about 15 years. I think you should read them. Bexley accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Why are you showing me this now? Because I watched history repeating itself with you and Elliot and said nothing. Regret shadowed Vivian's features. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. But when I saw you on that morning show speaking so eloquently about the invisible costs of family financial favoritism, I couldn't stay silent anymore. As they ate, Vivian filled in more details of the family history Bexley had never known. How David had struggled with depression exacerbated by his parents' constant comparison of him to Margaret. How he had built a moderately successful career as a session musician despite the lack of family support. How he had reached out multiple times over the decades only to be rebuffed. The most heartbreaking part, Vivian said as their dessert arrived, is that David never stopped trying to earn their approval, even after it became clear it would never be given. He kept sending birthday cards, Christmas gifts, announcements about his music. The wall of silence he received in return broke something essential in him. The parallels to Bexley's own experience were undeniable. And my mother, did she ever try to connect with him independently of their parents? Once, about 20 years ago, after your grandmother died. Vivian sighed. But by then, the patterns were too entrenched. Margaret couldn't see David without seeing all the ways he wasn't what their parents wanted. And David couldn't see Margaret without seeing all the opportunities he'd been denied. After dinner, Bexley walked along the riverfront, the manila envelope tucked securely in her bag. The summer night hummed with life around her. Couples strolling hand in hand, street performers drawing small crowds, the distant wail of sirens melding with laughter from a nearby restaurant. But Bexley moved through it all in a bubble of stunned clarity. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. The first direct contact in weeks. Your father and I saw you on the morning show. Couldn't you have chosen a topic less likely to embarrass the family? Call us. no congratulations. No pride in her professional achievement. Just concern about appearances and family image. It was so predictable that Bexley would have laughed if the pain weren't so fresh. But now, armed with Vivian's revelations, the text took on new dimensions. This wasn't just about her mother's disappointment in Bexley. It was about generational trauma repeating itself in precise, devastating patterns. Her mother wasn't just favoring Elliot, she was recreating the exact dynamic she had benefited from as a child. That night, Bexley stayed up until dawn reading the letters Vivian had given her. Uncle David's words across the decades chronicled a journey from eager to please son to confused young adult to increasingly bitter middle-aged man. The final letter, dated just a year before his death, contained a line that made Bexley gasp aloud. "I finally accepted that I was never the problem, Mags." The problem was a family system that needed a golden child and a scapegoat to function. I hope someday you'll see it too before you pass the same poison to your own children. Too late, Uncle David. Too late by decades. Before I continue with what happened next, I want to thank you all for following along with my story so far. This journey has been both healing and painful to share. If you're relating to any part of this family drama, you're definitely not alone. The comment section has been filled with similar stories. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect moment to join our community of truth tellers and hit that subscribe button. The next part of this story contains the moment everything changed. Trust me, you won't want to miss what my grandfather's secret letters revealed about our family's true financial history. Armed with Uncle David's letters and a journalist's determination, Bexley decided to investigate her family history more thoroughly. The professional skills she had honed over years of investigative reporting would now be turned toward her own family narrative, a story with deeper, darker roots than she had ever imagined. Her first step was to track down people who had known her uncle. Through social media and music industry contacts, Bexley connected with several of David's former bandmates and colleagues. Their recollections painted a picture starkly different from the family's official narrative of an irresponsible dreamer who couldn't get his act together. Dave was the most reliable guy in the industry, his former drummer told her over video chat. Studios would call him first because they knew he'd show up prepared, nail the session, and not cause drama. "He saved my ass more than once when I was going through my divorce. Your uncle helped me stay sober," another musician shared. 20 years clean next month, and I wouldn't have made it through those first years without him checking in every damn day. These testimonials contradicted everything Bexley had absorbed about the uncle she'd never met. The irresponsible black sheep had been in reality a cornerstone for many people in his community. Reliable, supportive, and deeply principled. Next, Bexley turned her attention to her grandparents' estate. As a journalist, she knew how to access public records, and what she found raised troubling questions. Her grandparents' will, filed with the probate court 15 years earlier, had indeed left the bulk of their considerable assets to her mother, with nominal amounts to Vivian and David. But an earlier will, superseded just 2 years before her grandfather's death, had divided the estate equally among the 3 siblings. What had prompted that change? The timing coincided with Bexley's mother completing her master's degree in healthcare administration, the responsible career choice her grandparents had approved of, unlike David's music or Vivian's photography. More digging uncovered property records showing that her grandparents had helped Margaret and Richard purchase their first home with a gift of $50, 0 inches, 1,988, equivalent to over $120 0 inches. Today's dollars. No similar gifts appeared for either David or Vivian. The pattern was undeniable and eerily familiar. One child elevated, the others diminished. Resources channeled to the worthy offspring, while the others were left to fend for themselves. And now, a generation later, the same dynamic was playing out between Bexley and Elliot, but the most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Aunt Vivian had mentioned that their father, Bexley's grandfather, had kept meticulous financial records. He was old school, Vivian had said. Everything handwritten in ledgers, every penny accounted for. On a hunch, Bexley asked Vivian if she knew what had happened to those ledgers after their father's death. I assume your mother took them along with everything else, Vivian replied. Though she might have stored them at the lake house, Dad's study there was left mostly intact after he died. The lake house. Bexley had almost forgotten about the family vacation property in the Adirondacks. Purchased by her grandparents in the 1972nd, it had been left primarily to her mother in the will, though, with usage rights for Vivian and David that had never been truly honored. Bexley hadn't visited the lake house since her college years. The prospect of going there now, potentially encountering her parents, made her stomach churn. But the journalist in her knew that primary sources, her grandfather's original financial records, could be the key to understanding the full picture of her family's financial dynamics. She called Vivian. Do you still have a key to the lake house? A pause. Yes, though I haven't used it in years. Your mother made it clear I wasn't welcome to just drop by. Would you be willing to let me borrow it? I want to look for Grandpa's financial records. 2 days later, Bexley was driving north, Vivian's rarely used key in her pocket, and a determination to uncover the truth fueling her journey. The risk was calculated. Her parents rarely visited the lake house outside of major holidays, and it was the middle of the work week in September. The likelihood of an unexpected encounter was low. The house stood silent as she pulled up the long tree-lined driveway. Leaves were just beginning to turn splashes of red and gold among the green. Memories flooded back as she approached the wraparound porch, summer evenings with sparklers by the lake, Thanksgiving gatherings with extended family, the Christmas, when 12-year-old Elliot had received a boat while Bexley got Dem a sweater. The key turned smoothly in the lock. Inside the house smelled of disuse and pine. Not unpleasant, but lonely somehow. Bexley moved efficiently through the main floor to the study that had once been her grandfather's domain. The heavy oak door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a room that seemed frozen in time. Bookshelves lined 3 walls filled with leather-bound volumes and family photographs. The massive desk dominated the space, its surface bare except for a reading lamp and an antique globe. Bexley began methodically searching through drawers and cabinets, looking for anything that might contain her grandfather's financial records. In the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, she found them. 5 leather-bound ledgers labeled by decade from the 1972nd through the 2010. Bexley's hands trembled slightly as she lifted them out, feeling the weight of family secrets in her arms. She settled at the desk and began to read, starting with the most recent ledger. Her grandfather's precise handwriting documented every financial transaction with obsessive detail, investments made and liquidated, properties purchased and sold, gifts to children and grandchildren. What emerged was a pattern more deliberate and calculated than Bexley had imagined. Every financial decision had been made with clear intent to channel resources to Margaret while maintaining just enough connection with David and Vivian to preserve the appearance of family unity. A notation from 2005 read, Educational Trust for Elliot established, $50,000 initial deposit. Consider similar for Bexley pending improved academic focus. Bexley's breath caught. She had graduated high school with a 3.9 gigapascals and numerous academic awards. What improved academic focus could her grandfather have possibly been waiting for? Another entry from 2009, additional $25,000 to Elliot's trust following Dean's List placement. Bexley's journalism scholarship noted, when way, no supplemental funds required. The systematic nature of the favoritism was laid bare in black and white. It wasn't subjective perception or oversensitivity on Bexley's part. It was documented policy, a deliberate strategy spanning generations. As she flipped through earlier ledgers, Bexley discovered something even more disturbing. In the 1982nd ledger, a series of entries referenced David's treatment and residential program with substantial sums attached. Uncle David had apparently struggled with depression severe enough to require inpatient care, a detail completely absent from the family narrative. More shocking was a notation from her grandfather: final payment for David's treatment. No further financial support as it enables dependency. Margaret agrees this is the appropriate boundary. They had cut off support for mental health treatment. Treatment likely necessitated in part by their own favoritism and emotional manipulation. Bexley was photographing pages with her phone when she heard the unmistakable sound of a car on the gravel driveway. Peering through the window, her stomach dropped at the sight of her father's BMW pulling up to the house. Heart-racing, Bexley quickly gathered the ledgers and looked frantically for a hiding place. The study had a small adjoining bathroom. She slipped inside just as the front door opened. Through the bathroom's partially open door, she could hear her parents' voices in the main hall. "I still think this is unnecessary," her mother was saying. "The lake house is perfectly secure. The security system company flagged unusual activity," her father replied. "Better to check it out than ignore it." They must have been alerted when she unlocked the front door. Bexley cursed, silently clutching the ledgers to her chest as she heard footsteps moving through the house. "Someone's definitely been here," her father called out. "The study door is open." Trapped with no way to escape undetected, Bexley made a split-second decision. She stepped out of the bathroom, ledgers in hand, facing her startled parents directly. "Hello, Mother. Father. Looking for these..." The shock on her parents' faces would have been almost comical under different circumstances. Her mother recovered first indignation, replacing surprise. "Bexley, what are you doing breaking into our property?" "Breaking in," Bexley replied calmly despite her racing heart. "I used a key. And technically, according to Grandpa's will, this house belongs partially to Aunt Vivian as well." Her father's expression darkened. "You had no right to come here without permission, much less to go through private family documents. Private family documents that detail exactly how the dynamic of golden child versus scapegoat has been deliberately perpetuated across 2 generations. Bexley held up one of the ledgers. "Did you know about these, Dad? Or was this all orchestrated by Mom and Grandpa?" Her mother stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Put those back immediately. Those are personal financial records that don't concern you. They document financial decisions made about me. That very much concerns me." Bexley stood her ground. "Did you know that Grandpa established a trust for Elliot when he was 15, with an initial deposit of $50,000, while noting that I would need to demonstrate improved academic focus despite my 3.9 gigapascals?" Her father glanced at her mother, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "Margaret, my father made his own decisions about his money," her mother replied stiffly. "If he saw more potential in Elliot's future, that was his prerogative." "And what about Uncle David?" Bexley pressed. "The uncle I never even knew existed because you erased him from our family history." "Did Grandpa make his own decisions about cutting off support for David's mental health treatment too, or was that a collaborative family project?" The color drained from her mother's face. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I have his letters, Mom. All of them. Years of reaching out, trying to maintain some connection with his family being systematically shut out." Bexley's voice remained steady despite the emotion churning inside her. "And I've spoken with people who knew him, colleagues, friends. The irresponsible failure narrative doesn't match reality. David chose his path," her mother insisted, "just as you're choosing yours now with this invasion of privacy. What I'm choosing is truth." Bexley placed the ledgers on the desk, keeping one hand protectively on top of them. What I'm choosing is to break the cycle before it destroys another generation. Her father, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. Bexley, regardless of what's in those ledgers, breaking into our property and going through private documents isn't acceptable. That's your takeaway from this, Bexley laughed incredulously. Not the documented evidence of systematic favoritism. Not the revelation that Mom's estranged brother, my uncle, existed and was essentially erased from family history. Just, I shouldn't have looked at the proof. Her mother moved toward one of the leather chairs, suddenly looking exhausted. You couldn't possibly understand the complexities of our family history. Then explain it to me, Bexley challenged. Explain why Elliot received $230,000 for his startup while I was told there was no money to help with my education. Explain why Uncle David's mental health support was cut off. Explain why Aunt Vivian was discouraged from visiting the lake house that she technically co-owns. A heavy silence filled the study. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, the lake beyond glittering like scattered diamonds. The beauty of the setting stood in stark contrast to the ugly truths being excavated within. Your grandfather had very specific ideas about family legacy, her mother finally said. He believed in concentrating resources where they would have the most impact. Based on what criteria? Bexley pressed. Because according to these ledgers, David was cut off despite being in a mental health crisis. I was deemed unworthy of support despite excellent academic performance. It seems like the criteria was simply who would conform most completely to Grandpa's narrow vision. Her father cleared his throat. Your mother was just following the patterns she was raised with, Bexley. We all inherit certain ways of seeing the world from our parents. Don't make excuses for me, Richard. Her mother snapped, a hint of vulnerability breaking through her composed exterior. I knew exactly what I was doing. The admission hung in the air between them. Bexley felt a strange calm descend over her, the righteous anger of months giving way to something more complex, a mixture of vindication and profound sadness. Why, she asked simply. Why continue a pattern that caused so much pain? You must have seen what it did to Uncle David. Her mother's gaze dropped to her hands, now tightly clasped in her lap. Because it benefited me, she said quietly. Because it's easier to perpetuate a system that advantages you than to dismantle it. Because I told myself Elliot needed it more, just like my father told himself I needed it more than David or Vivian. It was the most honest thing her mother had ever said to her. Not justification, not denial, just raw, uncomfortable truth. And you, Dad? Bexley turned to her father. You weren't raised in this family. You came in from outside. Didn't you see what was happening? Her father's shoulders slumped. I saw fragments, pieces. But I convinced myself it wasn't my place to interfere with your mother's family dynamics. And yes, I benefited too. From the down payment on our first house, from your grandfather's connections in my industry. It was easier to look away. Bexley took a deep breath, feeling decades of family history weighing on her shoulders. I don't want easy anymore. I want honest. I want fair. I want to know my full family history, including Uncle David and the systematic favoritism that's been documented in these ledgers. And what do you plan to do with this information? Her mother asked, an edge of defensiveness returning to her voice. First, I'm going to share it with Elliot, Bexley replied firmly. He deserves to know the truth about the advantages he's been given, advantages he may not have even been fully aware of. Then I'm going to continue my series on family financial inequality, drawing on our family's experience as a case study. Her mother's eyes widened. You wouldn't dare air our private business publicly. I won't use our real names, Bexley clarified. But I will tell the truth about patterns of favoritism and their long-term impact. Someone needs to break the cycle, Mom. If it won't be you, it will be me. The three of them remained in a tense standoff until her father finally spoke again. What would resolution look like to you, Bexley? What do you want from us now? It was a fair question, one that Bexley had been considering throughout her months of estrangement. I want acknowledgement of the pattern. I want genuine apology, not justification. I want you both to read Uncle David's letters and really see the human cost of this family dynamic. And I want some form of tangible repair, not necessarily financial, but meaningful. Her mother opened her mouth, likely to object, but her father raised a hand. We need time to process this, Bexley. What you're asking for. It would require us to reconsider some fundamental aspects of our family narrative. Take all the time you need, Bexley replied, gathering the ledgers. I'll be holding on to these in the meantime. Those belong to this house, her mother protested. I'll have copies made and return the originals, Bexley countered. But the information they contain belongs to our entire family, including Aunt Vivian, including Elliot, including me. As she drove back to the city that evening, the ledgers secure in her trunk, Bexley felt something shift within her. The confrontation hadn't provided the cathartic resolution of her fantasies, but it had accomplished something, perhaps more important. It had brought decades of carefully hidden family dynamics into the light, where they could finally be examined honestly. The painful truth was now visible to all. What her family chose to do with that truth would determine whether healing was possible, or whether the cycle would continue unbroken into yet another generation. October arrived with brilliant foliage and chilly mornings. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at the lake house. 3 weeks of processing, planning, and gradual progress towards something resembling resolution. True to her word, Bexley had shared the ledgers with Elliot, inviting him to her apartment for a conversation she knew would be difficult but necessary. His initial defensiveness, "Are you saying I didn't earn any of my success?" had gradually given way to genuine shock as she showed him their grandfather's meticulous documentation of decades of systematic favoritism. "I had no idea," he said repeatedly, flipping through pages that detailed financial advantages he'd received while Bexley struggled. "They always told me I was receiving support because of my potential, my responsible choices. I never questioned why you weren't getting the same." "That's how these systems perpetuate themselves," Bexley explained gently. "The favored child is taught not to question their advantage, and the unfavored child is taught to see their struggles as personal failings rather than the result of an uneven playing field." The most surprising outcome of their conversation wasn't Elliot's shock or remorse, it was his anger. "They used me," he realized aloud. "They used me as a prop in their narrative, as proof that their approach to parenting was right, and they damaged my relationship with my sister in the process." The recognition of their shared manipulation had been the beginning of a healing process between the siblings. For the first time since childhood, they began communicating honestly without the distorting lens of their parents' favoritism. Meanwhile, Bexley had continued her professional project, publishing the third installment in her family financial inequality series. Without using real names, she had incorporated elements of her family's dynamics as a case study, focusing on the intergenerational patterns of favoritism and their impact on sibling relationships and individual development. The article had gone viral, generating discussion across various platforms about hidden family financial dynamics. Bexley had received hundreds of messages from readers who recognized similar patterns in their own families. People who had spent years believing they were simply less worthy than their siblings, now beginning to question the systems that had shaped their self-perception. As for her parents, the reckoning was still unfolding. A week after the lake house confrontation, her father had reached out asking to meet one-on-one. Over coffee at a neutral location, he had offered something rare in the Harlow family, an unqualified apology. "I failed you," he acknowledged, his usual confidence notably absent. "I saw what was happening, and I chose the path of least resistance." I justified it by telling myself it wasn't my place to interfere, but the truth is, I benefited from the system too. I'm deeply sorry, Bexley. Her mother's journey toward accountability was proving more complicated. Having been both beneficiary and perpetrator of the family's toxic dynamic, she struggled to separate her identity from the patterns she had maintained for decades. Her initial attempts at reconciliation had fallen back on familiar justifications. We only wanted what was best for both of you, and families are complicated. But Bexley had held firm to her boundaries, refusing to accept anything less than genuine acknowledgement. I don't need you to be perfect, she told her mother during a tense phone call. I need you to be honest, with yourself first and then with me. The breakthrough came unexpectedly through Aunt Vivian. Having reconnected with her niece Vivian, had taken the initiative to reach out to her sister as well. The details of their conversation remained private, but its impact was evident when Margaret finally requested a meeting with Bexley. They met at a small restaurant near Bexley's apartment, neutral territory. Her mother arrived carrying a weathered shoebox, which she placed on the table between them after they ordered. These are the only photographs I have of David, she said without preamble. I told myself I was keeping them safe, but the truth is, I couldn't bear to look at them. At him. Because every time I did, I had to confront what our family dynamic had done to him. Bexley opened the box, carefully revealing dozens of photographs spanning decades. A young David with his first guitar, teenage David and Margaret at a lake that might have been the very one where the family vacation home now stood, adult. David performing on various stages. He was talented, Bexley observed, studying an image of her uncle playing guitar. His expression one of complete absorption in the music. Extraordinarily so, her mother agreed, a hint of something like pride breaking through her usual reserve. He could pick up any stringed instrument and play it within hours. It was like magic. As they looked through the photographs together, Margaret began to share stories. Real stories, not the sanitized family narrative that had erased David's existence. She spoke of their childhood adventures, of David's early musical promise, of the increasing tension as their parents began to channel opportunities and resources toward Margaret and away from her siblings. I didn't see it clearly then, she admitted. Or rather, I didn't want to see it. It was easier to believe I was simply more deserving, that I had earned the advantages through my own merit. And by the time you might have recognized the pattern, Bexley prompted gently. By then, I had incorporated it into my own identity. The responsible one. The successful one. The one who made the right choices. Margaret's voice caught slightly. Questioning the system would have meant questioning everything I believed about myself. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was something more valuable. An honest reckoning with the painful truth. As they continued talking, Bexley began to see her mother not simply as an antagonist in her personal story, but as another person shaped by the same toxic family system, someone who had made harmful choices but who was now, however, haltingly attempting to confront them. I want to make amends, Margaret said as their meal concluded, not just with words, but with actions. I've spoken with your father and we've decided to establish an educational foundation in David's name. The initial funding will come from selling the lake house. Bexley's surprise must have shown on her face. Vivian and I are the legal co-owners, her mother continued. We've agreed it's time to let it go. Too many painful memories, too much inequity built into its very foundation. The proceeds will fund music education scholarships for students who, like David, have talent but lack family financial support. It was a meaningful gesture, not erasing the past harm, but acknowledging it and attempting to create something healing from its legacy. There's something else, Margaret added, reaching into her purse and withdrawing an envelope. This isn't about buying your forgiveness. It's about trying to restore some balance where I can. Inside the envelope was a check, not for the full $230,000 that Elliot had received, but for a substantial portion of it. We've spoken with Elliot as well, her mother explained. He's agreed to return part of his business funding as his own form of making amends. The combined amount is what you see there. Bexley stared at the check, feeling a complex swirl of emotions. The money itself wasn't the point. She had built her career and financial stability without her parents' support. But the symbolic recognition of the inequity, the tangible acknowledgement of the favoritism that had shaped so much of her life, that mattered. "Thank you," she said, simply tucking the envelope away. Not for the money itself, but for what it represents. In the months that followed, the Harlow family began the slow, sometimes painful process of rebuilding on a more honest foundation. Family therapy sessions revealed patterns none of them had fully recognized, helping them develop healthier ways of relating to each other. Elliot and Bexley strengthened their sibling bond free from the comparative dynamic their parents had established. Margaret embarked on the complicated emotional work of grieving her brother properly, something she had never allowed herself to do while maintaining the family's official narrative about his estrangement. With Vivian's help, she organized a small memorial service on what would have been David's 63rd birthday, inviting his former musical colleagues and friends to celebrate his life and legacy. For Bexley, the most profound change was internal. The validation of her lived experience, the confirmation that the favoritism hadn't been in her imagination, allowed her to release years of self-doubt and internalized shame. The narrative she had absorbed since childhood, that she was somehow less worthy, less responsible, less deserving than her brother, could finally be recognized as the fiction it had always been. On a crisp December evening, almost exactly a year after the Sunday dinner that had triggered her estrangement, Bexley stood on the stage of a small community arts center. Behind her, a large photograph of Uncle David performing was projected on the wall. Before her, a small crowd had gathered for the official launch of the David Harlow Music Education Foundation. Family legacy is more than money or property. She began looking out at the assembled faces, her parents Elliot, Aunt Vivian, and dozens of community members interested in supporting arts education. It's the patterns we inherit, the stories we tell, and ultimately the truths we choose to face or deny. As she spoke about her uncle's musical talent, his struggles within a family system that had failed to support him, and the foundation's mission to provide opportunities he had been denied, Bexley felt the completion of a circle. The pain hadn't disappeared. Generational wounds never vanish entirely, but it had transformed into something constructive, even beautiful. Later, as the event wound down, her mother approached her with uncharacteristic hesitation. "David would have been proud of you," she said quietly. "Not just for the foundation, but for having the courage to break the cycle. It's something neither he nor I managed to do." "It's not over," Bexley replied honestly. "We'll all be working on these patterns for years to come, but at least now we're doing it consciously together." As they stood side by side looking at the photograph of the uncle she had never known, Bexley recognized a fundamental truth. The greatest inheritance we receive from our families isn't financial, it's the patterns of behavior, the Fendevises in hair pasta, unspoken rules, the emotional blueprints that shape our understanding of ourselves and others. The most important choice we make is whether to perpetuate those patterns unquestioned or to examine them with courage and, when necessary, to deliberately, consciously break them. For the Harlow family, that breaking had been painful but ultimately liberating, creating space for a new kind of relationship based not on concealment and comparison, but on the messy, imperfect, essential truth of who they were and who they might yet become. Before I wrap up this story, I want to thank each of you who've stayed with me through this entire journey. Your comments and support have meant the world to me during this challenging time of family reconciliation. Has anyone in your life ever experienced similar family dynamics around favoritism or financial support? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, or you know someone who might benefit from hearing it, please hit that like button and share it with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about family dynamics, personal growth, and the complicated journey toward healing family wounds. I'm grateful to have this community to share these life lessons from my family's karma story, and I truly believe that by sharing our experiences, we help others feel less alone in theirs. Until next time, remember that breaking unhealthy cycles takes courage, but it creates possibility for generations to come.